I feel kind of sorry for Rishi Sunak, because him and Jeremy Hunt aren't really a government at all. They're a crisis management team with a parliamentary wing, and they were sort of brought in to try and clean up the mess caused by Liz Truss. The awful truth is that
obviously I love Ash. I think she's great. But in these moments, when you talk about the failures of the UK economy, you cannot forget about George Osborne. I know I talk about it all the time. Everybody on my channel must be absolutely sick of it. But Liz Truss is not the one who's broadly to blame for the economic malaise of this country. George Osborne was the one who stripped away our health service, leaving it unprepared for the pandemic to happen. And then everything else has been damage control afterwards for every administration, every prime minister we've had since then, since the start of the pandemic. It was George Osborne's supply-side labour market reforms that depressed wages so that people's living standards could drop so far as soon as the inflation hit come 2022. It was George Osborne that continued increasing the debt to GDP ratio whilst continuing to make sure that our public services were in the worst position that they would be in to deal with something like the shutdown of the economy or a mental health crisis or people who are too sick to work, for example. All of these things that would enable us to have a cohesive society that's necessary for the state to spend money on, he cut that away to give quantitative easing money to his mates in the financial sector to prop up our ailing economy at the expense of working people. Those are all things that George Osborne did. Liz Truss coming in and then one day go, oh, the bond yields are a bit higher, or looks like the pension funds have to be bailed out by another round of QE. Like, this is a fly in the ointment. All of the damage was done by Osborne and Cameron. All of it. And I mean all of it. Liz Truss, like, she may have made some pensioners unhappy because their pensions were screwed up in retrospect. And, Liz Truss did bad things and had bad plans and would have made this economy worse, especially would have made the difference between the rich and the poor explicitly worse by cutting taxes for the rich. But none of this at all is anywhere near as bad for the broader long-term health of the economy. That is what the problem we're dealing with now. It's not an instantaneous problem. This is a long time coming that has been fermented by terrible economic policy where they cut state spending during a liquidity trap from 2010 to 2019. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be in the bad position that we're in at the moment. It would have still been bad. Liz Truss would have still done bad things. But the Tories would not be on course for electoral oblivion, and the people in this country would not have been immiserated as much as they had been if George Osborne hadn't done what he did when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Adam Curtis says quantitative easing is the biggest theft in all of human history. I mean, the water companies potentially might top that, but the kind of QE that George Osborne did specifically, I think that he's onto a point there, because that's what Adam Curtis called out in his video about that he did a while back. I forget what it was called now. Charlie Brooker featured some clips of it. But quantitative easing isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm in support broadly of some amount of quantitative easing in the right circumstances. So for example, look at, I did a TikTok about this before as well actually, the quantitative easing that George Osborne did. So in a liquidity trap, for people who don't know, is when you can't get people to borrow or spend money even by reducing interest rates to zero. So by you reducing interest rates to zero, you essentially make borrowing money free because you don't have to pay any interest on the money that you borrow when it comes as far as the base rate is concerned. So it makes investing and borrowing money really easy to do. And if people won't take that and still won't invest, still won't borrow, still won't spend, that's what's called a liquidity trap. You're trapped with no liquidity because people won't take the money to spend because they are so unsure of the economy they won't get returns. That's what we had from 2010 to 2019, for example. So until the recent kind of inflation spiral where interest rates went up slightly, it was comparatively a lot, but in terms of like nominal amounts, it was a slight increase in interest rates. People just weren't spending and the economy ground to a halt. But to keep the economy afloat during that period, I think it was O'Dearism, yeah. During the QE period, because you'll notice from the period of 2010 to 2018, the debt to GDP ratio continued to increase every single year under George Osborne, despite all of these claims of getting the country's budget under control, and despite all of these claims that they were reducing the public debt, because they weren't. Debt was going up, debt to GDP was going up, they did it every single year. And it was a lie. It was a big lie that they told to the public. And you know what they were doing with that QE money? They were just throwing it at the financial sector for them to play around with it, to throw it at investments, because these investments and transactions still count to GDP, still count to the size of the economy. So they could still say, look, there's some economic growth there because the financial sector is spending more, even though on the ground wages were stagnant, people had no money, there was a long-term depression amongst the consumer classes for working people of this country. And so they essentially propped up our failing economy by allowing financial sector people to throw around free money that he was giving them from the Bank of England. And that's a bad use of quantitative easing, because it just made rich people richer, because they took all of that extra liquidity and pumped it into assets like property, like luxury commodities, for example. The same thing they did during the pandemic. All of that new money didn't inflate commodity prices, but it did inflate asset prices. That new money that was created by the Bank of England during the pandemic filled it up to the rich. They invested in assets to bump up house prices. Gary talks about this. Gary Stevenson talks about this a lot. And this is a bad use of quantitative easing. What Jeremy Corbyn planned to do in the 2017 manifesto and stock buybacks, what Jeremy Corbyn tried to do, what he was planning to do during the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, was to do a thing called the people's quantitative easing. So instead of taking all of this new money, now outside of the European Union, we can invest. We can use monetary finance of government spending. So new money from the Bank of England can be used to finance government budgets. In terms of, so essentially you have the license to do MMT once you rid yourself of the Lisbon Treaty under the European Union. So by spending that new money, the plan was to invest in new cooperative businesses, new production, new manufacturing through the state, use that to increase the supply of goods and services by investing into the supply side of production, to strengthen the pound, to increase the number of jobs available, to increase wages, and to stimulate economic growth. So the money would have still been going into somebody's hands, just like George Osborne did. He still put it into somebody's hands for them to spend it to increase economic growth. But Corbyn would have done it to invest in businesses so that the people who were getting the money to spend, who were spending all of this extra stuff, who had access to the new commodities, were all members of the working class, normal people. That's the difference between good quantitative easing and bad quantitative easing. It's what I want the current government to do. I don't think you can do as much of it now that inflation is a little bit higher and the economy is not in a liquidity trap anymore. But it should definitely have been a thing that we should have been doing throughout the entirety of the Osborne period. And we just didn't. It's also a failure of Gordon Brown. Even though he helped the economy by doing QE, he didn't do enough of the people's QE. He didn't spend enough money giving it to people or in spending investment, and spent too much time propping up the financial sector as well. He just wasn't as bad with it as George Osborne, and didn't cut government parliament to do it either, and kept the welfare state high. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.